Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Louis Frumkes, the eponymous director of the Louis Burke Frumkes Writing Center or Center for Writing and Culture. The reason I'm saying all this is I wanted you to know we're doing an audio visual version of our speaking event tonight. We are contemplating going live in the near future or doing a hybrid thing where we do live and audio visual. What I would like all of you to do, if you're willing, is to email either Jillian, my assistant, or myself at the center and let us know if you would attend a live event. Short of that, we're going to continue doing it audio visually with all our wonderful speakers. And which brings me to tonight and our first great speaker of the fall, who is Kathryn Pilgrim, and I'm going to introduce her right now. Many of you will remember Kathryn as an anchor and correspondent for CNN, where she worked for 25 years. She anchored her own broadcast Early Edition in 1998 and 1999, and served as an anchor for CNN and Headline News for more than a decade. Starting in 2001, she was a primetime backup anchor for the 7 p.m. hour on CNN. She also won many awards, including an Emmy, Peabody, and the New York Society of Black Journalists Award for her reporting in South Africa. As an author, Kathryn used her reporting skills and a vast knowledge of international affairs. Parenthetically, she speaks Russian, but she speaks it fluently. I just speak a few words. And vast knowledge of international affairs. She speaks Russian, attended the Harriman Institute for Advanced Study of the Soviet Union to write romantic thrillers featuring archaeologist John Sinclair and a female oceanographer, Cordelia Stapleton. Scribner published the first in the series, The Explorer's Code, quickly followed by her second, Stolen Chalice, and then Summer of Fire. Kathryn is interested in science and exploration and is a fellow in the Royal Geographical Society in London and a full member of the Explorers Club of New York City. Gives me great pleasure to present Kathryn to you now with a fascinating talk she has prepared just for us at Hunter. Kathryn?
Louis, thank you so much. It's such a great pleasure to be here. And
me too.
I wanted to give a little bit of a talk about media these days, because I think it's a very important subject, and I do a lot of work in media. And although I do write fiction, the times are very serious, and it calls for some real thought about what we're doing in media. So this is my talk for this evening, and I've titled it "The Search for Truth in Media." And so let me just start with the phrase fake news. We really love to hurl that phrase around. And is it a problem? Well, is it just a thing that politicians say when they want to blame the media for carrying a message that they don't want to hear? Or maybe when we say fake news, we just don't like the message. Maybe we don't like the network that's delivering the message, or maybe even the anchor person. But luckily for us, a lot of research has been done on this, and we don't have to rely on opinion about fake news. So first of all, I'd like to give you some statistics on the prevalence of fake news. There was a survey done in June by the Pew Research Center. It found that 94% of journalists surveyed said that made-up information is a significant problem in America today. That's 94% of journalists. And 71% of journalists identify it as a very big problem. According to that study, 60% of journalists said they have had conversations in their newsrooms about made-up information. And 44% of journalists say they come across made-up information occasionally when working a story. So it is real. The professionals in the field are self-reporting the problem. And that same survey found that most journalists admit that their news organization does not have the guidelines in place on how to handle misinformation. So why is that? What's going on? About 2/3 of journalists blame social media. They say it influences their work. and social media is part of their day, but it has a negative effect on the news climate in general. So that's 75% of journalists blame social media for misinformation. They say that the digital age is wreaking havoc with the truth. Now, there are people who study this. The Frumkes Center at Harvard spends a lot of time examining the phenomenon of misinformation and its effect on society. Their focus is what they call data journalism. And this is the age when the media extends beyond the traditional sources of newspapers, broadcast, radio. But still, a lot of information is still curated by journalists. The news sources also include such lovely things as trolls and pranksters and political groups who develop tactics designed to anger and to trick people into their opinions. So let's start with a couple of definitions. Misinformation, that's erroneous facts, and disinformation, erroneous facts targeted at society to distort public perception. So the Frumkes Center for Media Misinformation Casebook is an interesting source for you to look at. It points to campaigns to misinform the public for the purpose of social manipulation. And so, for example, they look at medical misinformation during COVID. They look at social media activity that preceded the January 6th attack on the Capitol. So I suggest you take a look at that website if you want to go deeper into those subjects and how all that works. The Aspen Institute is also attempting to analyze a left or right bias in any reporting, and also to look into what they call conspiracy pseudoscience. And they point to what they call loaded words, phrases or words that attempt to influence an audience by appealing to emotions or stereotypes. Again, they have an excellent website, so I point you in that direction. But here tonight, I'd like to give you my thoughts on where we are today, especially in media. And I freely admit that this is opinion. Okay, so this is my opinion through my experience. And I have to say, I was in on the very dawn of the global news era. And believe me, we've come so far, so fast. And it's no wonder we're having a hard time to get our heads around the new world of media. We've barely had time to adapt. So at the risk of boring you, I'm going to go back in time a little bit to give you some perspective. So here's my concept. We've just seen the funeral service of Queen Elizabeth II play out on television. So being in the sort of British mode, this example sprang to mind, and I think it illustrates the rapidity of how our media has developed over the past few decades. So here's my example. I don't know if you watched the series Downton Abbey, but the first scene in the series is a bicycle messenger riding up to this grand English manor with the morning newspapers, and he delivers them. And in that particular scene, the morning newspaper contains the disastrous news of the sinking of the Titanic, which happened in 1912. So that was not that long ago. Now, the butler then proceeds to iron the newspapers to keep the dark print from getting on his lordship's fingers. And I'll add an aside. I remember when I was a child, some ladies would read the New York Times, including my mother, with white gloves on so they wouldn't get ink on their hands. That's a digression, I admit. But anyway, so in my early lifetime, to continue this saga, people got their news on paper, which had to be printed, hand-carried to newsstands, flung onto doorsteps by kids on bicycles. One of my colleagues at CNN, who's still working in the communication field, told me her first job in journalism was delivering newspapers by bike. So in short, not that long ago, we hand-carried the news. Now, if you think about it, we had been hand-carrying news for centuries. So think of the king's messenger riding through the night on a horse, or letters sent by ship. They took months to give news of family members. Our founding fathers waited weeks and months to get the word out of the outcome of a battle in the Revolutionary War. Jane Austen had the endless letter writing in the novels, giving the latest news from other parts of England. We literally had centuries of news being delivered on paper. So that was in my lifetime, it was still going on. Then entered the electronic age, and news came to us in pictures. And first we got the news at movie theaters. Newsreels ran just before the main feature of the film. And a lot of people got their news during World War II that way, to go to the movie, watch the newsreels first, then watch the movie. So fast forward to the 1950s, we have television. We watch news in real time. And this is totally groundbreaking, right? First time ever live news. Now, of course, we all still read the newspapers, but the immediate breaking news was in pictures. I don't know what your initial introduction to television news was, but mine was from watching Walter Cronkite, and he was the most trusted man in America, he was called. He was a fixation in American living rooms from 1962 to 1981, and then from 1948 to let me just start those dates over. From 1948 to 1963, the evening news was a 15-minute broadcast. That's what you got, 15 minutes. In 1963, it was a huge year. Vietnam War was going on, John F. Kennedy. It was a time for the news to expand to a half an hour. So the Cronkite newscast was a half an hour. It was like dinner in the dining room. It was an event. They called it appointment viewing, or they call it appointment viewing now in the news industry. 7 p.m. every night or 6:30, you have a date with the TV, you watch the news. And the format was really simple. It was a recitation of what happened that day. And it always ended with Walter Cronkite's tagline, the catchphrase, and that's the way it is. It was basically a bedtime story to the American family. So you watched, you felt informed, you believed it, then you turned it off and you went on about your personal life. They were much simpler times. Cronkite told us what happened. He did not tell us what to think. His role was to inform. So one thing I find about that era is interesting. Occasionally, and I mean really rarely, Cronkite would offer commentary or analysis as the last segment of the broadcast. But on the nights when he did end his newscast with personal analysis, he always omitted the phrase, and that's the way it is. He took that away because it was a personal analysis. So there's a very clear line between reporting and commentary. That was journalism. Well, I just love TV news. I used to learn a lot from that TV as a child. I watched men walk on the moon. I watched the Beatles play on the Ed Sullivan Show. There were tragedies, scandals, the Kennedy assassination, the Nixon resignation. Some say that the Kennedy assassination was the first time that broadcasts interrupted their scheduled programming with a breaking news incident. They cut into a soap opera in the middle of the afternoon, and it was a single announcement. The president was dead. It was an epic moment, true breaking news. Now, every other minute, as you know, we have breaking news. Standards have changed. Too many breaking news graphics, in my opinion. That is my opinion. You can have a car chase going on in a small rural county in no place, and we'll sit there and we'll watch the helicopter live shot as if our lives depend on it. It's like breaking news as a form of entertainment. Anyway, not helpful. We are not better informed. It's all just clickbait. So to conclude this very obvious point, in my generation, we have come from hand carrying bits of paper to instantaneous global communications. And we all have handheld devices in our pockets where we get all our information, not just news. And our information comes from this. We can FaceTime with family. We can watch a war unfold in real time. We can check our stocks. We get all of our information, music, movies, television. We can even meet our future husbands and wives on social dating sites. We can feed our addictions, Wordle, TikTok. We get everything from that little square of magic in our pocket. That's communication in the last 100 years. So no wonder our heads are spinning. Now, I don't share the sky is falling sentiment of my generation. I love the information age. I feel lucky to live in an era of communication, 24-hour news all day, all the time. I remember CNN began. I started at CNN. I remember when CNN began, we did not have Google. We did not have ubiquitous access to the internet. So 24 hours of news was a game changer. That up until then, you had to wait to find out what was going on. And the rumor was that Ted Turner was such an insomniac that he came up with the idea of 24-hour news one night when he couldn't sleep and he wanted to find out what was going on in the world. So with CNN, appointment viewing, going to the TV at a certain place at a certain time declined. If Cronkite was like the family dinner, CNN was like McDonald's. We started consuming on the run, grab and go. Monitors popped up in airports, in delis, and sports bars. And this was the very beginning of the screen-oriented culture that we're in today. So over the next few decades, the delivery system, the screens got small. Well, first they got bigger and bigger and bigger. Then they got smaller and smaller and smaller. And we consumed our news in fragments, in increments, and we consumed it on the run. So some say, like fast food, we get no real nourishment from this kind of consumption. It's too disorganized, it's fragmented. That's a debate we could have all day. The fact is, this is what's happening. The delivery systems have changed. So the 24-hour news broadcast started by CNN was emulated by Fox, MSNBC, a host of other outlets, cable. And in that moment, the format changed. So CNN had reporters in bureaus all over the world. We gathered the news. It was news gathering, the old-fashioned way. We sent people out. They found out what was going on. It came back into the bureaus. With cable competition, not many networks had that kind of budget. It costs a lot to do that. So it was much cheaper to build a set. So they put people at anchor desks, and then they put in some so-called experts, and they talked about what was going on. It was not really news per se all the time. It was talking about the news, and the format changed without really many people realizing what was happening. That's where opinion journalism snuck in. In those roundtable discussions, people would project forward what they thought would happen. Now, that's not news. And it's kind of funny because sometimes even now when people hear I'm in the news business, they'll ask me, what do you think is going to happen to the economy? Or what's going to happen in Ukraine? Or what do you think is going to happen in the midterm elections? To me, that's the opposite of journalism. That's guessing, that's opinion. So it's kind of funny that we've actually automatically gone over to this. So over the next decades, the news product was spliced, diced, shared across blogs, social media, webcasts. It was broken into smaller fragments, tinier sound bites, little shards of information. Then we get even tinier Instagram photos with caption, Facebook clips, Twitter blasts, 140 characters, TikTok snippets. I mean, tinier and tinier and tinier bits of informational news, or sometimes not. We basically have little news snacks all day long. So I can see a couple of downsides to how we've evolved. Now, to the uninformed, all sources are equal. Some people don't consider the source of any of that information. It's also pretty time consuming. There's no single source. We got newsletters, podcasts, Twitter posts. We have to click through articles, links. You can spend all day on news and still not feel caught up. And also that kind of a digital product generates fakes. And there's a whole cottage industry that's sprung up for people who call those fakes out. Also, lastly, and I think this is really something, the spectacle is supreme. The more extreme the video, the louder the shouting match, the more people watch. So that's where we are. Now, how do we put the seal of authenticity on our communications today? How do we avoid the fake news? Well, one way is we brand the sources. So consider the source. You've heard the expression. Think about the red CNN logo, the Fox logo, the NBC peacock. How about TikTok, Instagram, the little Twitter bird? And when we reference these things, when we talk about it, I read it on Twitter, I saw it on TikTok. We even brand people who deliver the news. I heard it on Rachel Maddow, Anderson Cooper, Chuck Todd. Actually, that's not that different. I heard it on Walter Cronkite. The branding gives it legitimacy and context. Not always legitimacy, but always context. So let's just go through a couple other points. Aren't the facts just the facts? Can you just stick to the facts? Well, not anymore. How can we ever forget Kellyanne Conway explain alternative facts? So it's incumbent on the consumer of news to check your facts. I'd like to make a point about interviews. It's an easy way to generate news, to do an interview. Yeah, one camera crew, reporter, a subject to interview. But this is, again, getting very confused. What is entertainment and what is a newsmaker interview? There's like two different kinds of interviews. There's a big difference between Lester Holt interviewing somebody and Jimmy Kimmel or Stephen Colbert interviewing somebody. Entertainment interviews don't have the same journalistic standards. Entertainment outlets will sometimes make a deal with the interviewee about what topics are off limits. So there are some questions they will not ask a person on Entertainment Tonight or Access Hollywood or sort of evening talk show. Journalism's different. Hopefully, journalism's still different. A newsmaker interview with a politician or a head of state, there are not deals cut about what questions can be asked. There's no topic off limits. We sometimes blur the line between information and entertainment. So next time you watch an interview, keep that in mind. And also, in the interest of sorting out all these different elements, social media is curated information. So you live in your own silo, and we all know this. The more you click on something, the narrower your targeting can become. So after a while, you're self-perpetuating your own information loop and you're not getting outside information. So you must be aware of this. So in the current climate, there's also a problem with accountability and relevance. In social media, you really don't have to be relevant to get a lot of attention. So in traditional news, things that really don't count fall to the bottom of the rundown in the news show, and they eventually disappear out of the broadcast. And if they're not relevant, then they're not really reported on. In the digital sphere, totally irrelevant things could take on a shelf life of their own. So videos of baby goats can get more churn than an interview with the Secretary General of the United Nations. So relevance is kind of out the window in some of these platforms. Also, image curating. So you can create a false sense of who you are. If you're a political figure, this is particularly dangerous. You're not subject to professional media scrutiny. So social media really is a one-way street. You pump out your message or your image, and you can have lots of media attention without the accountability of someone challenging you on that. So those are my points on where we stand in truth in media today. There's some things to think about. And I would like to actually hear some of your thoughts about it. This hopefully is a two-way street. So in the interest of doing the question and answer session, let me do this. I'm going to pose 3 questions to you, and you can either give me your thoughts on them, you can think about them later, or you can ask me something else. So here are my questions to you. So the old expression is, journalists write the first draft of history, right? We now have cameras in our hands all the time on our phones. In terms of news, this creates opportunities for citizen journalists, really everyone, to record events as they unfold. So my question to you is, do you think having these cameras all the time helps the news narrative? Do you think that, second question, do you think our constant visualization of ourselves through selfies, constant pictures of ourselves, improves or diminishes our sense of self? And also, third question, news organizations will use the videos and sometimes put a disclaimer up like, these photos could not be independently verified. Yet the visual impact is the same as if they were shot by a professional journalist. We're taking in the information unfiltered. Do you think that these amateur videos and pictures should be held to another standard, or is this just the inevitable evolution of a technology and the impact it'll have on news going forward? So those are my 3 questions to you, and I toss it back to our moderators to handle the question and answer session.
Kitty, can you hear me?
Yeah, sure can.
Okay. Not only was it a brilliant talk and the questions themselves provocative and brilliant, but let me ask the first question before I turn it over to the audience, and maybe Jillian will field some of the ones that come in. Your talk was so interesting and evocative of ideas that while your novels are splendid. It makes me wonder, are you going to turn your talk or the thoughts in your talk into books?
I
And
had,
if not, please do, because it's so stimulating.
Louis, I'm a talker. I was on TV for 30 years, right?
Right.
So I actually like to talk as much as I like to write. And so I think my I had new thoughts about this morning. Like, this is evolving. Like, I had the thought about Queen Elizabeth's funeral as I watched it.
Sure.
And the paper, the thing with paper. So I like to stay really fluid. And so I would love to do a book, but I would like to stay right on the cutting edge. So the websites that I talked about in the beginning, I like to stay right on the edge of those and see what's happening and stay in the moment. I also very strongly feel that we are in such dangerous times. We are in such critical times now, geopolitically, domestically, that we must keep our eye on this and not turn it into an academic subject. This is an absolutely active thing that we should all be looking at, discussing, and wondering about from minute to minute.
Fine answer. I think your 3 questions deserve 3 books, but let's go past that and see if the audience has questions of their own. Jillian, has anyone sent in questions?
Hi, yes. Roa says that I think over the next couple of years, your concerns will be overwhelmed by deep fakes. This new technology will make it extremely difficult to know what is real and what is fake.
Is that a statement or a question?
I think it was a statement, but I obviously love your...
But I would like to actually engage with that. I think that the deep fakes really have me concerned because, back when we were cutting tape and, we went, in my lifetime, we went from shooting on film to shooting on 1-inch to shooting on 3/4 to shooting on VHS to shooting digitally. The ability to manipulate images has improved so much. And the ease with which you can manipulate images. And I know it's just going to get, tougher and tougher and tougher to tell what's real and what's not real. This concerns me deeply. And I don't actually know. So my ability to understand the technology of this, I really have to rely on experts. And I can analyze, but I'm not a very technical person. So I would defer to a technical person to actually discuss this in depth. But to my knowledge, you can have stuff that you can't tell the difference. So that does worry me a lot. That worries me a lot.
Jillian?
Yep. Here's another question from Scott Daspin. Do you believe there should be regulation on news agencies similar to FINRA and SEC for financial markets? If false news is reported, Scott says you should be held accountable. There also seems to be political agendas on the news. When Biden says the pandemic is over, don't people realize that's for votes?
Okay, we're going to break that one out a bit. Should news organizations be regulated? So I spent my entire career one of my specialties, Louis mentioned, was studying Russian. And then I was in the early days in the Soviet Union and in a lot of repressed societies where freedom of speech was repressed. And so I tend to err on the side of allowing, everyone to blab out their innermost thoughts and let it rip. And that's the way that I like my society to be. Now, sometimes at the dinner table, you're stuck with your crazy uncle who you really would like to disabuse of some of his ideas. But mostly I like it that people say what they think and you can debate ideas. And I think that debate can be taken into the sphere of journalism. You can have roundtables where things are discussed and debated. And so I'm not a big fan of regulating conversations, either professionally or personally. So that's where I fall on regulation of media, speech, and all that. the second thing was, do people know they're being manipulated? Is that was the second question, or politicians manipulate? I'm sorry, Jillian, could you just hit me with that second question again?
No problem. There were 3 parts. The second part is, if false news is reported, you should be held accountable.
Right. So what I think, I mean, so these organizations that I started with are actually trying, they're attempting to sort through the noise and to set criteria where they can identify left-leaning bias, right-leaning bias, fake news and all that. So there are people who are attempting to put some kind of accountability on this space. And I love that. I think that's great. And I really am very impressed. I just did a media conference out at East-West Center in Honolulu. And they had the director of the Shorenstein Center at Harvard there. And her depth of knowledge on the technology of, manipulation of like opinion is really vast. And so I do love it that people are holding news organizations and information sources accountable and pointing out that the world is being manipulated. But do I vote for regulation on it? Perhaps not, but it should be part of the discussion in society. Yes.
Kitty, may I add and append what you're saying and raise the question in terms of Scott's question about accountability? There, in my opinion, is no absolute certainty about anything. Therefore, asserting accountability and acting on it is a very, very difficult problem. And again, I think your new second book should address that.
You keep pushing that. You're going to make me sit down and start that book tonight.
I hope so.
Yeah. No, I mean, I take your point. It's a bit of a problem, because if you overregulate, you curtail free speech. And, when you've been in societies where that's done, and still is in many societies, you really run away from that as fast as you can. But I do think we have to be educated consumers. We were very naive. Our parents were very naive. And I was very naive when I was, a young person, to watch the evening news broadcast and just take it for gospel truth, and now, there's analysis of like some of the events of my lifetime where the truth was somewhat manipulated. And, the Vietnam War springs to mind. And, certain situations were not represented fairly to the American public. And so, we have to just be smarter about this. We can't be so naive.
Jillian, any more questions?
No, but I have a personal question.
Go ahead.
As someone who has read all of Kitty Pilgrim's books,
Go ahead.
I want to know where John Sinclair and Cordelia Stapleton come from.
Oh, okay. So we'll go into the literary side.
I'm so sorry.
It's good. I mean, I like it. It's all me, I'll tell you how I started writing the books. I was anchoring the 7 p.m. broadcast. I was writing a piece a day for broadcast. I was doing several cut-ins. I was working myself to the bone. And when I would start my commute home, I needed to just take my mind out of the newsroom. And so I started reading fiction. Well, a lot of literature and like really good fiction is about conflict and, deep anxieties and pain and, it's deep stuff. So I thought, well, I have to read lighter stuff. So I started reading lighter and lighter and lighter stuff. And as I did that, I started to think I could write some of this. So I started making up my own people and my own characters. And I did it for fun, just to pretend that I was in another world on my commute home. And so I made up Cordelia, my female character Cordelia, because I really love oceanography, and I was very active in Woods Hole. And, I do a lot of this exploration stuff with the Explorers Club and National Geographic. So I decided, what's the coolest job I could give my female character? She's an oceanographer. And then, so that's water. And then the male character has to be the opposite, of course. And so he's land, he's an archaeologist. So I have water and land, and they can go anywhere in the world they want. And so then I proceeded to go anywhere in the world I want to research my books. And that's how I ended up with
Kitty,
this.
I want to interject again. I know you spoke for me in 2013, but
Right.
your talk tonight and your books are so stimulating and fascinating that it makes me want to re-invite you and re-invite you and re-invite you. So when we get off the air, and Jillian, make a note, please, for me about this, I'd like to re-invite Kitty with another talk to be determined, the subject to be determined. And tonight I wish to thank you for what I think was a superb talk, and I hope the audience loved it as much as I did. Thank you, Kitty.
Thank you so much, Louis. It's
Mm.
always a pleasure.